Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at Moses and Joshua in our continuing study of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. I'd like to take you to Mount Sinai. The traditional location for the mountain is in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula. There has been a monastery located there for 1,500 years, so it's been continually inhabited. And you'll remember, even back in the Old Testament, the location of that was not forgotten after the Exodus. Elijah knew exactly where it was. He could run down there when he was fleeing Jezebel. And so I think the tradition probably gives us a good location. Now, if you go there today, they'll tell you that, this mountain is technically Mount Horeb, and the one behind it is Sinai. That may be the case, but it's probably just two different designations for the same place. Mount Sinai, that is in the wilderness of Sin, and then Mount Horeb, that seems to be the same name, just means dry, the same name from which we get the word Arab. So, a mountain in what they would have called the place of the Arabs, although when we usually think of Arabia, we think of further to the east. They had a much bigger picture of what Arabia was. Now, it's here that we receive the Ten Commandments. And when we look at those, the first 4 commandments deal with Israel's relationship with the Lord, while the last 6 commandments deal with men's relationship with one another, how to get along with others. In the first 4 commandments, we have reasons given for each of those commands. I'm the Lord your God. There's no other gods, no graven images. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Keep his day holy. And in each case, we're given specific reasons as to why we are to do that. In the last 6 commandments, no reasons are needed because these were universally known and applied. You see, the first 4 commandments, they are completely unique to this Constitution. There is no other society in the ancient world that had similar laws to those that are found in the first 4 commandments. The idea of only having one God, of not having graven images, of not taking the Lord's name in vain, of keeping a certain day holy, that was unknown in the ancient world. But the last 6 commandments, those laws are common to most ancient cultures of that day. They all had laws about don't murder and don't steal and don't take somebody else's wife and don't bear false testimony. Now, the last one is unique there, so let me just offer a caveat there. The one about coveting, I don't know of any other ancient law that said anything about coveting. But for the most part, the last 6 commandments are common to the ancient cultures of that day. Now, as we get to the book of Leviticus, that's all books about worship, and what I want to focus on briefly here is the instructions about the Ark of the Covenant. This box, and it was a wooden box overlaid with gold with the statues of 2 cherubim. A cherub is singular, and when you want to say it in the plural, cherubim. These 2 mighty angels with their wings overstretched over the top of the Ark of the Covenant. And this signified the throne of God. Certainly you've seen pictures or maybe movies of litter bearers carrying the throne of the king, and he's actually seated on that throne, and they're carrying him into the palace or wherever he happens to go. Likewise, the Ark of the Covenant was sort of the throne of God. That's what it represented. Now, you can't make an image of God because God's invisible, but you had images of these 2 sort of royal honor guards, these 2 cherubim, overlooking and looking toward the center of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was placed into the tabernacle, and the climactic part of the book of Exodus, right at the end of the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 40, verse 34, is when God moves into the building. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, so that this became the central place of worship for the people of Israel. Now, they did not yet have a land, so the tabernacle was a temporary affair. It could be taken down and moved to a new location, as the children of Israel would move to a new location. But then it was the Lord who was taking them through the wilderness, through the cloud and through the pillar of fire, and it would come to a place, and then it would stop, and that's where they were going to build the tabernacle, and the people would camp all around it. So they were a whole tribe, 12 tribes if you want to be accurate, of nomads that were wandering through the wilderness, as it turned out, for a period of 40 years. Now, at the end of the wilderness, actually early in the wilderness wanderings, they attempt to enter the promised land. They attempt to enter in the area of Kadesh Barnea, coming up from Sinai. They're going to try to go in the land, and they fail. And the book of Numbers tells the story of their failure. It's a failure of faith, where they send 12 spies into the land, and 10 of the spies say that those guys are way too big for us. There's no way we can do that. And 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, come back and they say, well, God, they're big, but God is bigger. But the people listen to the majority report instead of the minority report, and they rebel against God. And God says, okay, then in that case you're going to wander in the wilderness for the next 40 years. And they say, well, they rebel again. They say, well, we're going to go take the land anyway, because God said they can't do it. Have you ever noticed people sometimes try to do it? You tell them you can't do it, and then they say, well, we're going to try to do it anyway. They try to take the land, they fail miserably, and they end up there in the wilderness now for 40 years. At the end of the 40-year period of wandering, and of course the first year or two had been down by Mount Sinai, getting the tabernacle and things like that. But at the end of that entire period, they're going to go into the land, but instead of coming up through Kadesh Barnea, they're going to make a detour around the Dead Sea. Now they ask permission to go through the land of the king of the king of Edom. And the king of Edom says, no, you can't go this way. And God says, don't fight them. Don't try to go through their land. Don't try to trespass. Instead, make a detour around the land. And they do that. They come up, again, past Moab. They don't actually go through Moab, but they circumnavigate both Edom and Moab to come into the promised land from the east, on the east side of the Jordan River. So as we zoom in now to the east side of the Jordan River, now there's 2.5 tribes, Reuben and Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh, that come up to this territory, and they look at the land and they say, this looks pretty good. I always used to wonder about that until I myself happened to come to this area on the east side of the Jordan River, and I was standing on a mountain looking across the Jordan River Valley to the west, and all I could see was just the east side of the mountains on the west of the Jordan, and they're rather dry because the rain all falls on the east side of those mountains down near the Mediterranean. But the west side of those mountains, it looks rather dry and barren, and if all you were doing is looking at it, looking by sight rather than by faith, you'd think, well, gee, Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh made the right decision. But as it turned out, that's going to be the wrong decision, because every time an invader comes in, either from the east or the west not so much from the west, but east, north, or south, they're going to come up first against these 2.5 tribes. So that's really not going to, in fact, by the time that we get to the New Testament period, this part of the land won't even be thought of as Israel. This will be thought of as the Decapolis, the 10 Greek cities. Now, when we get to the book of Deuteronomy, it has been noted that the book of Deuteronomy is structured similar to what's known as a suzerain treaty. Now, a suzerain is a big ruler, and he might have other little rulers around him. So you have the big rulers. The big ruler, he's the suzerain. The other minor kings in the neighborhood, they would be called vassal kings. I'm just going to call them small kings. And we actually have, from the 2nd millennia BC, certain suzerain treaties. And these treaties follow a particular format. They would begin with the preamble, a short listing of the parties, and the party of the first part, the party of the second part, and this king versus that king. And then after that, there would be a historical prologue that would tell the story between these two kings, what has been their past relationship. Maybe they didn't always get along, maybe they've always been friendly, but it sets forth the relationship between these two kings, how they came to enter into a treaty. Next, we would have the stipulations, the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots, how we are to act one toward another. You are not allowed to invade my land, and I'm not allowed to invade your land, and if you're gathering weapons, you need to tell me, and if somebody else attacks us, then we're going to team up against that. And so there's all sorts of stipulations on how we're going to get along. Next, there is requirements for the deposit and the reading of the covenant. You see, there are going to be 2 copies made of this covenant, and you take your copy, and if you're the vassal king, you take your copy, and if you're the suzerain, you take your copy, and they each take their copy back to their temple and place them in their temple, and then every year they're going to pull those out. They're going to bring them out, the copies of the covenant and read them in public, so that there were requirements that the copies of the covenant be kept and treasured, but then read upon certain occasions. Finally, there are witnesses that are given, and then there are curses and blessings. Curses if you break the covenant, and blessings if you keep the covenant. In fact, the ancient way that you would enter into a covenant, remember back in the days of Abraham, God had done something like this with Abraham. God had instructed Abraham to kill an animal, or several animals as the case was, and not just kill them, but then divide them into, actually cut the animals into two parts. And then those who were entering into the covenant would pass between the pieces of the animal. Now in Genesis chapter 15, God enters into a covenant with Abraham, and the presence of God passes between the pieces. Abraham doesn't do that. It's a sort of a one-party covenant. God's making a covenant with Abraham, but God is the one who binds himself. And what is being said is that whoever breaks the covenant, may what happened to those animals happen to the one breaking the covenant, so that there's a curse put on the one making a covenant. Blessings if he keeps it, but curses, the ultimate curse being death, if he breaks the covenant. Now what I have described to you is the outline, not just of a suzerain treaty, but also the outline of the book of Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy is set forth in the likeness of a suzerain treaty. And God is the big king, and the people of Israel, they are the little king. They are the vassal king. He is entering into a covenant with them, and if they break the covenant, they will receive the curses. And if they keep the covenant, they will be greatly blessed. And God enters into that covenant. Now, do you remember a part in that where there are not one, but two tablets? You know, when I was a lot younger, I thought that the tablets of the covenant, the 10 Commandments, the tablets of the covenant, that there were two tablets because maybe you just couldn't fit them all on one tablet. It was like, I ran out of paper, and so I just go to the next page. But that's not the case. In fact, we're told in the scriptures that the tablets had writing on the front and on the back. And it's not that you couldn't fit it all, but remember, when you made a covenant, you made two copies. And one copy would go with one party, and the other copy would go with the other party. And in this case, God says to Moses, you take both copies because I'm with you. And God is going to reside not just up in heaven, God is going to be with his people. Where your copy goes, my copy goes, and I'm with you. He is the God who is with his people. The way you say that in Hebrew, he is the Emmanuel, the God with us. Well, Moses dies at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. And as the book of Joshua picks up, he is going to take them. He's going to take them into the land. And that's what the book of Joshua is. They're going to cross the Jordan River, and they come now into the Promised Land. The problem with the Promised Land is there's other people already living there. There are Canaanites living there. That's why it's called the land of Canaan. Now, it's interesting that, and we mentioned this already when we were looking at Egypt, at Tel El Amarna in Egypt in 1887, there was a woman who was digging for. Actually, she was digging for fertilizer, certain, stones and things that she would use. And she had found these tablets, and she was breaking them up to fertilize her crops. And somebody said, there's writing on that stuff. It might actually be more valuable if you sell it to somebody than if you use it as fertilizer. And sure enough, there were these tablets that she had found. She had been breaking them up for fertilizer. And they were letters written in Akkadian cuneiform, not in hieroglyphs. They were written in Akkadian cuneiform, and they were official letters, and one of them was a letter from the king of Jerusalem to the king of Egypt. And it's written right around the time of Joshua. And the king of Jerusalem is saying the Habiru are coming into the land. And we need help, or else all the lands of the king are going to be lost. Well, the El Amarna tablets then give us, I think, a independent testimony to what was taking place in the land of Canaan as Joshua and the Israelites are coming into the land. Now, I'm not saying that all Habiru are necessarily the Hebrews, but the term Habiru meant the wanderers, and certainly that described the Hebrews, the Israelites, who were coming into the land. So here we have this, and like we said, it's in Akkadian, and it speaks to what was taking place, not just in Egypt, but also in Canaan of that time. And Egypt in the past had held a certain authority over Canaan. Remember, Thutmose III, he had marched all the way up to not through Canaan, all the way up to the Euphrates River 17 different times. But that had not been the case of late. Ever since the Exodus, the Egypts had been sort of a hands-off everywhere else. And now the land was being lost completely. And so we have Joshua coming to the land. Of course, the first thing on the agenda is going to be Jericho. Jericho is known as the city of the palm trees. You can go there today. It's in the Western Bank area, and there's palm trees everywhere. And it's quite striking because as you're coming down from Jerusalem to Jericho, it's a very barren area, and you get down to here, and it's just a sea of palm trees. The city of the palms. It's actually called that in the Old Testament. This city lies some 600 plus feet below sea level. It's down in that Jordan Rift Valley. It's a watered area where there are some natural springs. And there have been archaeological digs here that found in ancient Jericho, and we have to be careful here because there was a one Jericho that was there in New Testament times at a slightly different location, in the same general area, and a bit up the hill, as it were, was Old Testament Jericho. It had a double-walled fortification system, and the walls had come down. John Garstang excavated this area from 1930 to 1936, and he pointed out that the walls had fallen outward. Now, one of his students at a later date came back and did further excavations. This, first of all, they discovered not just Old Testament Jericho. We want to point out they discovered ruins upon ruins upon ruins because it was a great place. And so sometimes Jericho might either be destroyed or abandoned or whatever. So we have, going back to Neolithic times, New Stone Age, that's what the word Neolithic means. This was a very ancient city, going back thousands upon thousands of years. And it had been not inhabited continually, but at different points along the way it had been inhabited. And Kathleen Kenyon, one of Garstang's students, came back to this area. By this time she had become the director of British School of Archaeology from 1952 to 1958, and she did more excavations in Jericho, what she called the trench method, cutting big trenches throughout the city. And she said she felt that Garstang was wrong. She said, no, there's no evidence of the Exodus here. In fact, at the time of the Exodus, the city, there was nobody there. You couldn't actually take the city. Of course, when she's saying the time of the Exodus, she's not talking about the 1440s or the 1400s. She's talking about much later because maybe she'd been watching too many Cecil B. DeMille films, but she was thinking of the Exodus as having taken place in the 1200s. And looking for Ramses as being the pharaoh of the Exodus. Well, I think she's right in that regard. I think she's right in that Ramses, at the time of Ramses, there was no Jericho here. But I think she was looking in the wrong place. Recently, Bryant Wood, another archaeologist, went back through her findings and pointed out that some of the mistakes that she had made along the way, and that indeed there is evidence, including scarab evidence. In other words, scarabs, you would have a scarab of a certain pharaohs, and included in this was a scarab of Pharaoh, remember her name, Hatshepsut, a very rare scarab, showing that Jericho was indeed inhabited at the time, not the time of that late Exodus, if you're trying to put the Exodus in the days of Ramses, but an Exodus at the time of Amenhotep II and the 18th dynasty rather than the 19th dynasty. Now, when we look at Jericho, Jericho's, remember, down in that river valley, the Jordan River Valley. We're told that Joshua comes across the Jordan River. And the Jordan River today is pretty easy to cross. In fact, I didn't actually try this, but I was crossing the Jordan down in that area. I'd crossed it going into Jordan further north, and then I was coming back from the country of Jordan into Israel and crossed it in the area of Jericho. And the river is so small that I felt like maybe if I had gotten out of the car and taken a running jump, I might have been able to jump across the river. Probably overly optimistic in that, but it seemed very small. Now this was in July when I was doing that. If I had been crossing it earlier in the year, it might have been somewhat different, but there are today a number of dams that dam up the river, and they have taken that water and taken it both in Jordan as well as in Israel and used it for irrigation. And I'm glad. That's a good thing. That's not bad. But as a result, the Jordan River has gotten very small. And in biblical times, it was a seasonal river. Sometimes it would be high. In the springtime, when you're right at the end of the rainy season and the snows from Mount Hermon are beginning to melt, that river overflowed its banks. In the summertime, it would start to dry out, and by wintertime, it would get quite small, almost like it does today. Which means that it was easily fordable in the wintertime. It was easy to cross it. They didn't have any bridges back then. They do today, but they didn't back then. But in the spring and very early summer, it was impassable. And guess when Joshua crossed? He crossed in the springtime at Passover. Well, he crosses the Jordan River, and the Lord stops the waters of the Jordan. Now, it's not like there's the separation thing, but rather we're told that the waters were stopped all the way up at a place called Adam. That's all the way up, almost to the Jabbok River, like almost 20 miles to the north. It's been reported, and I've not been able to verify this, so I almost hesitate to share this with you, but that back in I think it was supposed to be back in the 1920s, where a cliff on the area of Adam collapsed and actually created sort of a natural dam, dammed up the waters for a good 24 hours. Now, I'm not sure if that's really the case. I've tried to find independent confirmations of that, and so far I've been unable to. And so I can't help but wonder maybe if that's an urban legend. But whatever the case, we're told in the biblical account that that's where the waters were stopped. And of course, if you stop one end of a river, the rest of it's just going to flow down. It would flow down into the Dead Sea, and they make the crossing. Now remember that Joshua sends 2 spies into Jericho. I always have to laugh about that Moses had sent 12 spies, 10 had given good reports, or bad reports, 2 had given good reports, and Joshua, as it were, tells 10 of the spies they can stay home, and he's only going to send the 2. But he sends 2 spies, and they come to Jericho, and they meet with a prostitute by the name of Rahab, who has heard what the God of Israel did 40 years earlier back in Egypt, and she has come to believe, she and her family, and she protects the spies, hides them, and then lets them over the city wall, and they escape, and they make it back. And Jericho is taken not by good intelligence or not by good warfare, but God gives them the city. God actually knocks the walls down of the city, and they capture the city of Jericho. The next city is the city of Ai. And I would like to be able to take you to the ruins of Ai, but we're not entirely sure where it is. There are several locations that have been suggested. The problem with this is that we don't have any of these cities. There's not like a sign that's been discovered, "Welcome to Ai" or something like that. So it's a little bit difficult to determine. Now we're told that it's west of Bethel, between where it lies between Bethel and the sea. So that maybe helps us give a general location. That's what I've done here on the map, but I don't want to be too dogmatic on that. The next city after that we do know a bit more about, and that's the city of Gibeon. And Gibeon, remember the city of Gibeon, they came to Joshua, they sent to a few representatives with very old clothes who came over the hill and into the Israelite camp and said, we came from such a far away that these clothes were new when we started. And so they enter into a treaty with Joshua and the Israelites, and the Israelites sort of gullibly enter into it, not realizing they're just from over the hill. We've actually have the pool of Gibeon, where it was built next to a water source and near to a freshwater spring. You can go and this sort of arrangement is actually quite commonplace. You have something similar over at Megiddo. And the water shaft goes down to a place where water could be approached from the spring. There are tunnels that lead out to it under the city walls. Again, you see the same sort of construction over in Jerusalem. But that spring, now that doesn't come into the story in Joshua's day. Actually, it does come into the story when we get to the book of 2 Samuel. And you can see some events that take place there with Abner and Joab and some of David's mighty men. That they come back to that scene later on. But Gibeon enters into a treaty with Israel, and when Israel finds out they've been duped, they still keep the treaty. And this brings about a conflict. It comes about, Joshua chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, it came about when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, and just his name is interesting because remember, Genesis chapter 14 talks about a previous king, hundreds of years earlier of Jerusalem, who'd been named Melchizedek. That is, Melech is the word for king, Zedek is the word for righteousness. This was Adonizedek. Literally his name means Lord of Righteousness, but I'm not sure how righteous he was because he's against the people of God. He heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land, and he feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities. When you talk about the royal cities, that's some of the cities that Egypt had sponsored, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty, and they had gone over to the side of the Israelites. Now notice what's happening. Israel is coming into the land, but there are cases, at least there's one case, where the people of Israel and the people of the land are sort of teaming up. So instead of a conquest, it's been a sort of a friendly conquest. And the king of Jerusalem, this Adonizedek, he puts together a confederation, and they are going to come up against Israel. So this confederation, here we have Gibeon, and this confederation of kings from the south, Jerusalem and Hebron and Lachish and Jarmuth and Eglon. And some of these cities, Jarmuth we don't read about that much, but Lachish, you can go to the ruins there, and Hebron is still occupied today. Jerusalem, of course, you know about. Eglon as well. And these cities band together, and they attack Gibeon to try to punish Gibeon for having teamed up with the Israelites. And the people of Gibeon send word to the Israelites, say, hey, we're in a treaty, come help us. And they do. And a conflict erupts. And the conflict is decided, or at least the route that takes place, is at a place called the descent of Beth Horon. It's actually to the northwest of Gibeon. In Joshua chapter 10, verse 11, and it came about as they fled from before Israel while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, that the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah. That's a good deal south. We'll look at that in a second. And they died, and there were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. Again, this battle takes place, but the Lord enters the battle, and he takes more casualties with these hailstones, stones from heaven, stones from the sky, than are actually killed in battle. Stones mean Hashemayim, from heaven, from the sky, from the up there place. And so here's this battle that takes place, and in the midst of the battle, Joshua is going to do something quite unusual. In the midst of the battle, we read that Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nations avenged themselves of their enemies. And then the book of Joshua actually quotes another book. It's a book we don't have. He says, is it not written in the book of Jasher? You know how sometimes you're writing a scholarly paper and you footnote something. Well, that's what's happened here. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? And then this sounds like he's quoting from the book of Jasher here. And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. What happened here? What took place? There have been several interpretations for this passage. First of all, there is the poetic interpretation that says that term stand still can also have the idea of being silent, as though this was a command for the sun, maybe not to shine quite so brightly. Maybe in the heat of the day you said, hey, give me a break, and it sort of cooled off. But the problem is that the moon also stands still, and the moon doesn't have anything to do with the heat. And so the poetic interpretation really has an issue here, unless you're just poetically talking about sun and moon. But its meaning seems to be lost if we're seeking to have a mere poetic interpretation. Alternatively, there have been some who said, well, maybe it was getting late in the day, and Joshua was saying, gee, I'm not finished with the battle. I need to mop up here. And so he's calling for the sun to shine more brightly. Again, I think they're grasping at straws. That's not the natural way to read the passage. Instead, I tend to take it literally. That in some way, shape, or form, the sun appeared, at least, to stop in the sky. Now, I don't know how God did it. There have been all sorts of speculation on that, because think about this. The Earth turns at the equator, it's turning about 1,000 miles an hour. It takes 25,000 miles. It's 25,000 miles in circumference, and it takes 24 hours to go around. So at the equator, it's about 1,000 miles an hour, which is really fast. And to stop that, it would just be chaos. Of course, on the other hand, I read about chaos. I read about stones falling from the sky and killing more people being killed by that. But still, I'm not sure what to make of that. And I don't want to even suggest various theories because they would be speculative. But I think that, at least from the appearance sake, and remember that's what we have oftentimes described in the Scripture, the way things looked. Just like when I get up in the morning and I look up and I say, gee, the sun just came up. Well, really the earth turned, and I know that, but it looked like from my vantage point the sun came up. And so here again it looked like from Joshua's vantage point, and I have no idea how it happened, it looked like the sun stopped. That the light continued to shine. And what's more, we're told, not only did it stop, we're told that it did not hasten to go down, that it just seemed to just stay up there. Not forever, but for an unusually long amount of time. Now, was this localized? Was this something that you just had a bright light there for a long time? Or was this affecting the entire planet? We're not told. So, again, we shouldn't be speculating. We certainly should not be dogmatic either way. And I think it's even dangerous to speculate. Joshua chapter 10 verse 14 though says, and there was no day like that before it or after it. So, again, that doesn't mean we can, say, well, gee, these sorts of things don't happen. And that's the point of the passage. These sorts of things don't normally happen. There was no day like that before it or after it when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. This was an unusual occurrence. Every once in a while, I hear an urban legend. I need to mention this that says NASA did some search in their computers and they found Joshua's missing day. Let me tell you, I first heard that urban legend back when I was in school, back in the early 1970s, before computers were much more than glorified adding machines. It's not true. It's just an urban legend. And nothing like that ever happened. And what we ought to do when we hear such things, first of all, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. Not true. But we always ought to check things out. You hear that there's been a discovery or an archaeological find. Check it out from a reliable source. And until you find it's true, I think it's okay to be a little skeptical. Well, let's continue. Next we have, we had the Confederation of Kings of the North. Next we have in Joshua chapter 11 a confederation of kings. That was kings to the south. Now it's kings to the north. With Hatzor, it looks like Hazor, but if you go to Israel, they'll call it Hatzor. And a number of other cities, Shimron and Madon and Achshaph. And these cities likewise enter into a confederation with the lead city being Hatzor. In fact, Hatzor was the biggest city in the entire area. was a huge double city. The older part of the city was built up on a hill, but it had overgrown its walls and had spread out to the sort of, I'm starting to say valley. It's not really a valley, but to the level place beneath it. The city's been excavated, and it had a number of different times when it was populated, both in the 1400s under Joshua, and it was destroyed at that time, and then would at a later date be rebuilt, and we see that in the book of Judges, where again it's an active city and there are people there, and then again much later in the days of Solomon. So it's going to have a number of habitations. Now we get to the end of the book of Joshua, and Joshua is a big success story, but I think there are some failures that take place. First of all, we just noted he made a treaty with Gibeon, and that probably wasn't a good thing. But also he failed to take Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, when we get to the book of Judges, in fact, even when we get to first, and it's not until 2 Samuel that Jerusalem is finally captured, he also failed to permanently drive out the Canaanites, so that I have both Israelite and Canaanite living in the land. Now, one of the arguments that's made against the historicity of the book of Joshua is that you look at that period and there's still Canaanites there. Well, the book of Joshua says there were. That the Canaanites are still living in the land with the Israelites. And that's part of the problem. And we have the testimony of the scriptures that is the case.